I'm Sandy Goldberg from Antenna Audio. Welcome to the podcast series from Emory University's Carlos Museum. In each episode, we use an object from the museum's collection as a starting point. We'll get to that object in a moment. It sparked a lively conversation about the dead. Well, the American dead, and the American way of dying from the 1800s, and the way it suddenly came to resemble the way of dying in ancient Egypt. Joining us today are Peter Lacavera, Curator of Ancient Egyptian Art at the Carlos Museum, Professor Gary Latterman, who teaches about American religious history, and Kevin Kuharik, Director of Restoration at the Historic Oakland Cemetery Foundation in Atlanta. Starting us off is Peter Lacavera, our Egyptologist. Now, what happened with Americans becoming aware of ancient Egypt around this time? What historically was going on?
Beginning with the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt, that created a great craze in Europe of Egyptomania. Particularly, there was a publication that the French government did, very lavish publication, because when Napoleon invaded, he not only brought his army to Egypt, but brought a whole platoon of scientists and scholars and artists, and they produced these enormous folio volumes called The Description of Egypt, and those sold widely throughout not only Europe but America. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of his own, and it was also in libraries and universities throughout the United States. And that was often used as a copybook for motifs which were derived from ancient Egypt and then used in 19th century architecture. It seemed even then to be very restricted to cemeteries.
So at Oakland Cemetery, do you have some Egyptian-looking things there?
We do. The most noticeable one, it's highly visible from a busy street nearby, and it's called the Khan's Gateway. It's made of granite, and it has a flat roof and battered walls, a Cavetto molding, and a beautiful sun disk with serpents and bird wings.
Cavetto moldings? That brings us to our object for this episode. If you can see images wherever you're listening to this, you can see it now. It's a false door, a ubiquitous part of ancient Egyptian tombs. This one is about 3 feet tall. Ancient Egyptians were buried deep underground, of course, but above that would be a little room with one of these false doors. The door was believed to be the magical portal for the dead to receive offerings.
The false door was the most important part of the tomb. And this particular one is part of a family tomb, and Egyptians were tended to be buried together in family groups. And this is for a daughter and her mother. And people were supposed to come on certain feast days and holidays, leave food offerings at the false door for the spirit of the deceased, and then they could eat the leftovers. So it was a big kind of almost a social thing, and there were actually certain days when lots of people would go to the cemetery and picnic. And this is a very typical example, which again is the panels, usually a little plaque showing the deceased at a table of food offerings, and then surrounded by the Taurus molding and the Cavetto cornice, which are typical of Egyptian architecture.
In the 1800s, American cemeteries made a radical shift. Suddenly, they became pastoral settings, places appropriate for family picnics.
That idea really emerges in the middle of the 19th century and is especially tied with what's known as the rural cemetery movement that begins really in Boston with the creation of Mount Auburn Cemetery. And this is a place where people and families can go and be with their dead, not be afraid of the dead.
What was it about Egypt that seemed to take hold? What made sense to Americans that they should put Egyptian motifs in their graveyards?
This was a time in which there was a great deal of interest in alternative views of the afterlife and alternative ideas about the meaning of death. And certainly with all of this information that's coming and all of this ripple effect of interest in terms of what's being discovered, you begin to see just a greater kind of association of Egyptian themes with ideas about death.
As an Egyptologist, Peter, when you go to these faux Egyptian things in cemeteries, what strikes you about them?
I think probably the idea of permanence, which is probably why it was so apropos, among other reasons, for a cemetery.
And sort of just the bigness to them?
Yes, they're massive, yeah.
Certainly you have pyramids as well, just as a theme
yes.
becomes quite popular in cemeteries around this time as well.
The obelisk, we have dozens, maybe hundreds of obelisks.
Now, when you were saying the Victorians really like these pastoral graveyards. What were they before that in America?
Well, before these rural cemeteries really took off, most burial grounds were associated with churches, so they would be just, churchyards for the most part. A lot of it had to do with new ideas about public health and science and the importance of keeping the dead and the living somehow separated, but allowing for certain kinds of cemeteries to invite people to come in and to at least spend some time with their deceased relatives.
So what about this whole idea of resurrection? I mean, since the Egyptians were preserving their bodies so well, was that appealing? So then the Christian would someday be resurrected in a better state?
There was a strong desire to make sure the body was intact and maintained even as it decomposes, and that's important for Christians who are especially theologically concerned about end times and resurrection.
How was that played out on the American scene? Did most people even hear about all this Napoleonic stuff coming out in the archaeological discoveries?
Yeah, well, Egypt was quite popular throughout America at the time. Even early on, you have early exhibitions. There was the very famous Dr. Abbott collection. He went to Egypt in the 1830s, I think, and bought a bunch of Egyptian things to show in Manhattan. But there was another man named Glidden who went around the country in circuses and unwrapping a mummy. And after he was done unwrapping it, he'd secretly wrap it up and move on to the next town.
And you could see that in different aspects of popular culture around this time as well, beyond the cemetery and the architecture. And in addition to what Peter was saying, there's also some of the earliest films pick up the motif of the return of the mummy. You also have, as another kind of place of architecture where you see this theme, are the new movie palaces. They become movie theaters, places where you really pick up on Egyptian themes, and you have a number of commentators relating how going into one of these movie theaters and seeing these images, again, this is the early years of cinema, sort of brings to mind the notion of spirits and the dead sort of returning to life. So there's a lot of interesting overlap and richness in popular culture as it relates to Egypt in this period.
And did that extend, on the funerary level, were people actually interested in mummification?
Certainly you begin to see at around the time of the Civil War an increase in the use of embalming as a way to preserve bodies. This is really a signal event in the history of American deathways.
So people didn't embalm typically before that period?
Embalming was really unheard of before the Civil War, and particularly with Northern families who were trying to get their family members back from the Southern battlefields, that really a whole new group of enterprising undertakers and businessmen experiment with different modes of preserving the body.
In fact, listen to an ad we found from 1850 with an illustration of an Egyptian-style coffin. It advertises Fisk's metallic burial cases, and it says the cases, airtight and indestructible for protecting and preserving the dead, made of iron, are just what has been wanted for preserving the dead from decay and from the ravages of the dissecting knife. What's that mention of the dissecting knife all about?
Fears of grave robbing, or even fears of someone coming to take the body and bring it to a medical school for it to be
Did that
dissected.
really happen, or was that sort of an urban legend of its time?
No, these things happened, and again, this is even before the Civil War, middle of the 19th century, when when really the medical establishment as we know it today really didn't exist. So medical schools, which so desperately needed bodies to train and educate medical students, didn't have the access that people have today.
The local Atlanta newspapers were reporting around 1878 that grave robbings had occurred at Oakland Cemetery, and there were stories of the night watchmen being offered bribes by students for the remains. Typically, they would prey on the indigent and African Americans, and this is particularly the case in Potter's Field. They would only remove about a third towards the head of the grave, break open the wooden coffin or casket, and then just drag the body out.
Oh, so they didn't have to deal with the casket itself.
That's correct.
Oh. So in Egypt, were cemeteries separate like they are in an American cemetery, or was this mixed in with their living buildings?
No, usually the cemetery was set apart. Often, actually, it was on the other side of the Nile, usually on the western side, which is where the Sahara is. And in fact, a euphemism for dying was going to the West. So people would specifically go out there to visit the dead.
When we were talking about all the stuff coming from Napoleon and Americans really getting interested in this new ideas of the afterlife, does this coincide with what we think of as a spiritualism movement? Are we in the right time period?
Well, if we're talking about the late 19th century, we're definitely in the right time period. And at this point, you have a kind of craze in what's called spiritualism, which is a whole movement, great popular interest around seances and finding ways to communicate with the dead. This is after the Civil War, which is one of the deadliest, obviously, in U.S. history. But there was a great deal of interest in trying to find alternative means to communicate with the dead beyond the authority of the church. Another piece of this, too, is in the evolution of the funeral industry, where you really begin to see in their advertisements they will incorporate different kinds of Egyptian themes, playing on these themes of preservation, life after death, that are alternative to the Christian images and motifs, but being used in a sense for the business of death.
Well, that is very American, isn't it, too?
That's exactly right. And we tend to think, the death industry shouldn't at all fall prey to commercial capitalist interests, but it is a whole story of commercialism and capitalism.
Even today, there's some place, I think, in California where you can be frozen in a bronze Egyptianized sarcophagus. So.
Sure, I'm sure that they get a lot of people interested in that.
So not only are you saved on this earth, but you're guaranteed sort of resurrection in the next in case it doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly. Cover all bases, which is a very Egyptian thing to do.
That's right. And American.
Yes.
Yeah.
That theme really is important in thinking about the ways in which the funeral industry begins to incorporate Egyptian themes. They really explicitly talk about a funeral for a king. I mean, they play off of that and the notion of the pyramid and the kind of monumentality of it all that I think resonated with American sensibilities.
Did it have to do with American democracy as well? That, you don't have to be a king to be buried like a king. Do you see that at Oakland?
Absolutely. There is a great deal of conspicuous consumption, consumerism.
Well, I was going to say what you just described could have been taken verbatim out of an advertisement in a funeral magazine in the early 20th century. I mean, they were playing off of these themes of democratization.
Really?
Having a funeral that's fit for the king, but that anyone can afford. And even embalming, is used in terms of the mythology that is emerging in the funeral industry in the early 20th century, is seen as something that was in ancient Egypt exclusively for the royalty, but in 20th century America is available to people from every class.
So it's ancient Egypt, only better.
Exactly. That's part of the American way, and ingenuity is, borrowing from other cultures, but making it better and making it more profitable.
Of course. So, Peter, as an Egyptologist, when you see all these borrowed and maybe watered down Egyptian motifs all over the place, how do you feel about it? Do you think that it's a sort of a tip of the cap and a nod to ancient Egypt, or do you think, they've just got it all wrong?
No, I think they're always with us. They, our roots are in Egyptian civilization. Even Christianity, the whole idea of the ultimate resurrection of the body really comes from ancient Egypt, from Christianity's roots in ancient Egypt. It's certainly not part of Judaic tradition. So there's so much about ancient Egypt that really resonates with us today. So
it's
it feels
okay.
very comfortable.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We had a great time with the dead today.